Hello there, I'm TheUtterChrisp and I'm here to tell you quite simply that Final Fantasy IX is a literary masterpiece. If you're watching this without somehow having already experienced the raw magic of Final Fantasy IX and wish to see it for yourself without any of the spoilers from this video, then I'll just say the following about Final Fantasy IX up front. If you like whimsical fantasy, strong, colourful characters, each with their own compelling stories and agency, stupidly stunning towns and set pieces taken straight from a picture book of fairy tales, as well as a roller coaster of a plot which hinges on, amongst other things, strong existential themes of life, death and nihilism, then Final Fantasy IX is the game for you. Of course, if you've already played and or beaten Final Fantasy IX as I have, then you know that all of this and more is contained within this wonderful gift that Squaresoft bestowed upon us back in the year 2000. Taking place in the predominantly medieval, somewhat steampunk world of Gaia, Final Fantasy IX, through its 8 main cast members and countless more supporting actors, embarks upon an epic tale which, in its own words, touches upon the themes of virtue, sorrow, dilemma, indulgence, devotion, despair, arrogance, and solitude. It is a story of 30 to 40 hours told at an incredible pace. It's littered with shocking occurrences, mind-blowing events, and fiendish twists and turns. Final Fantasy IX's storytelling is so generous that it basically contains its own sequel. Its vast collection of party members and side characters weave an incredible tapestry, each person a complex, winding thread of events and emotions, making up the part of a greater whole. In the spirit of the game, as it was originally made, I have decided to divide up this review into 4 chapters of varying length, each representing a single disc, much like how Final Fantasy IX originally launched as a 4-disc release over 23 years ago. Usually a Having a Mosey review is structured rather firmly around a story, gameplay, aesthetics trifecta, but you may find that it's a little bit more different this time, and I'll be curious to see what you think. To provide a bit of a contents page for you, in short, Disc 1 is entitled An Irrevocable Past, and is a short history on the origins of the Final Fantasy series, as well as the less than ideal circumstances in which Final Fantasy IX found itself launching to. Disc 2 is called I Want to Be Your Canary, and discusses how Final Fantasy IX tells its story and builds its world. Disc 3 is named You Are Not Alone, and it is within this section that I take a particularly deep dive into the main themes of Final Fantasy IX, discussed through the lens of its primary protagonists and antagonists. Fair warning, this is where the spoilers are. Finally, for Disc 4, we have Melodies of Life, in which I talk about the various aspects of Final Fantasy IX in terms of its game design, from gameplay to graphics, mini-games to musical scores. Today, more than ever, I'd like to ask you to please consider dropping a like or a comment if you enjoyed this video. This one took me quite a bit longer to make than usual. You can't simply skim the surface of a Final Fantasy game, especially one as detailed and elegant as number 9. With all that said, please sit back, relax, and enter Disc 1. The year was 2000. The turn of the millennium had come and gone without any kind of computer/data related apocalypse, and the future seemed bright and optimistic. Especially so if you are a producer or consumer of the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy I had initially released in 1987, developed and published by Square and directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi. At the time, the company had been facing bankruptcy, with this project being somewhat of a last-ditch effort on its part to turn things around, a Hail Mary if you will. It is from this which the name Final Fantasy originates, having originally been conceived as fighting fantasy. Thankfully, that first game outperformed expectations and saved the company, the rest being history. Fast forwarding 10 years and 6 games or so, in 1997, Final Fantasy came to Sony's PlayStation 1. I'll fully admit that I have yet to experience Final Fantasy VII properly, though I am actively working on this, yet I'm fully aware of just how important that game was, to the series, to the PlayStation, and just to gaming in general. It was the first time that Final Fantasy had transitioned into the third dimension, with its striking pre-rendered backgrounds and admittedly somewhat blocky 3D character models, 7 was particularly noteworthy for almost entirely moving away from Final Fantasy's, well, fantasy roots, focusing instead on a more dystopian sci-fi setting to tell its story. Clearly, the gamble paid off, as Final Fantasy VII continues to be one of the most best-selling games in the series at around 15 million copies sold, not to mention the continuing success of the remake. After the success of Final Fantasy VII, Square doubled down with Final Fantasy VIII, keeping it away from the more fantastical and giving it a more modern setting. 8 is considerably more controversial than 7 for a number of reasons, though still enjoyed a massive release culminating in around 12 million sales, released only 2 years after Final Fantasy VII in 1999. This was just 1 year before the release of the Sony PlayStation 2. As I've mentioned previously in my SSX review, the PS2 was kind of a big deal. As of the beginning of 2013, over 158 million consoles have been sold. Of course, development on Final Fantasy X also began in 1999, bringing forth rumours of a cutting-edge, next-gen Final Fantasy just over the horizon. As such, this was the climate that Final Fantasy IX's release found itself in. For better or for worse, Square decided to squeeze just one more mainline Final Fantasy release onto the PlayStation 1, a last hurrah to speak, to round out the trilogy on the console. Originally envisioned by Hironobu Sakaguchi as a reflection of what had come before, a greatest hits compilation if you will. In an interview with IGN in the run-up to its release in the year 2000, he describes Final Fantasy IX as his favourite in the series, saying, "It's closest to my ideal view of what Final Fantasy should be." Additionally, in the same publication, the game's art director, Hideo Minaba, said, "As this is the last single-digit Final Fantasy, we wanted to give the feeling of a series watershed, a sort of grand collection of what has come before." As you can see, they were all clearly feeling a little introspective over at Square during the production of Final Fantasy IX. It presented them a chance to look back and round up the best of what they had done, before conducting a digital victory lap in the form of Final Fantasy IX, before looking forward to the brave new world that was the third millennium and the second PlayStation. Unfortunately, despite releasing to critical worldwide acclaim, Final Fantasy IX released with considerably poorer sales than either of its immediate predecessors from the PS1, flying somewhat under the radar for many years, particularly when compared to the amount of discussion seen for 6, 7, and 8. Thankfully, it's 2023 now, so you're allowed to say that Final Fantasy IX is the best one, with a considerably lessened risk of getting accosted by an army of Buster Sword or Gunblade-wielding maniacs. Let me tell you, the 2000s were wild. You'd say you liked Final Fantasy IX the best, and then bam, just like a big old blitzball would hit you in the face or something. Very unpleasant. Over the course of this review, I'm going to be telling you exactly why Final Fantasy IX is my favourite one, and after experiencing it for yourself, perhaps Final Fantasy IX can be your favourite Final Fantasy too. Much like how Disc 1 of the original PlayStation release of this game was the smallest slice of the gameplay pie, Disc 1 of this review is also now fast approaching its end. For you see, the stage is set, the actors are ready, and the curtain rises. So please do switch over to Disc 2, the performance is about to begin. Final Fantasy IX is an allegory, is as glaringly an obvious statement of truth as war is bad, water is wet, or that I use flowery language to make it sound like I'm an authority on whatever it is I'm talking about. Much like an onion or an ogre, the story of Final Fantasy IX is layered, each surface generously coated with narrative intrigue, getting peeled away layer by layer over the course of the journey until by the end of the game we have reached the core, the absolute fundamental truth of the matter and of life, the universe, and everything really. Of course, I'm not going to tell you what it is right now, that would be cheating. Towards the end of the previous part, I likened the structure of this review to that of a stage play. Any keen-eyed observer and appreciator of Final Fantasy IX may have seen what I was doing there, as Final Fantasy's story is also likened to a stage play within the game itself in the form, rather fittingly, of a stage play. What I mean is, amongst other things, Final Fantasy IX is a love story. This takes place over the entire course of the game between the main protagonist Zidane and Garnet Till Alexandros XVII, otherwise known as Princess Garnet or Dagger. This is reflected by a fictional play within the universe of Final Fantasy IX, a Romeo and Juliet-esque story entitled I Want to Be Your Canary by Lord Avon, both a romance and a tragedy. In the very early hours of Final Fantasy IX, the first 4 playable party members are introduced, all centering around the production of this very play. Princess Garnet, haunted by a recurring nightmare of 2 hooded figures being lost at sea, is to attend the performance. Steiner, rusted knight and loyal guardian, is to be there as her escort. Vivi, the curious boy with a shrouded face, holder of a fake ticket, resorts to other measures to sneak inside to view the show. Finally, Zidane himself. Zidane is part of a thespian and thief troupe, the Tantalus Gang, attending the fairy tale city of Alexandria to perform the play itself. Of course, it isn't as simple as all that, as the gang have an ulterior motive. Tantalus has arrived, proudly astride their airship Prima Vista, not only to perform Lord Avon's I Want to Be Your Canary, but also to kidnap Princess Garnet, for reasons quite yet not disclosed. Of course, this plan goes rather sideways when it turns out that the princess actually wants to be kidnapped. You see, her mother has been acting quite out of character of late. Steiner doesn't see it, blinded to a fault by his loyalty to the crown, but Garnet knows better and feels the need to escape, to seek help. After a brief chase sequence through Alexandria Castle and the bowels of the theatre ship, Zidane and Garnet team up, much to Steiner's chagrin. Using the play as cover, Garnet assumes the role of Cornelia, the Juliet of this tragic tale, to avoid arousing her watching mother's suspicions. Steiner unwittingly finds his way into the script too, as does Vivi whilst fleeing castle security. Garnet's cover is promptly blown, and Queen Brane orders her capture. After several squabbles with Steiner, and despite Brane's best efforts, the gang escapes, crash landing in a particularly spooky woods, the Evil Forest. This epic introduction kickstarts the events of Final Fantasy IX, and it doesn't let up for the rest of the game. This is not the last you'll hear of I Want to Be Your Canary and its importance. I'll be revisiting it at a later point in this review. Final Fantasy IX's storytelling is immaculately done, and the various ways in which it chooses to regale its tale are practically all introduced to you within these early moments of gameplay. You'll note that the narrative has already jumped between several characters, namely Zidane, Steiner, Dagger, and Vivi, and will continue to do so going forwards, encouraging the ensemble cast to all get their time to shine. Final Fantasy IX cares a great deal about its characters and the way that it tells its 8 individual stories. I'll be diving into each character in turn over the next segment, but for now just please believe me when I say that the way that Final Fantasy IX fleshes out and develops its characters rules, okay? It is at this point in the story that the narrative camera pans out somewhat, introducing the player to the good old-fashioned overworld. As such, I'll take this opportunity to start talking about the storytelling and world building of Final Fantasy IX in a somewhat more general sense. Final Fantasy IX uses several different avenues to guide us through its twisting, winding, epic journey. Firstly, upon launching the game for the first time, we're treated to one of Final Fantasy IX's beautiful full-motion video cutscenes. FMV was definitely a little hit and miss back in the day, but due to Final Fantasy IX's ingenious chibi stylings, the character models and general world design actually translates to the medium very well. These FMV cutscenes are typically reserved for the more dramatic instances across the story, of which this game has its fair share. Fun fact, in the newest versions of Final Fantasy IX, the half remastering of sorts, upon completing the game, you can go back and view any of the cutscenes you want. That's dope. It's because of this lovely little convenience that I can tell you that Final Fantasy IX has 40 of these cutscenes, making up a hefty chunk of the overall experience. Besides this, an awful lot of Final Fantasy IX storytelling happens in-engine, chiefly through its eloquently written dialogue. Despite the absence of any voice acting, each character still manages to sound like themselves, written suitably differently from each other in a way that gives them all their own voices. Zidane is upbeat and cocky, he jokes around a lot. Steiner, at least initially, is uptight and stubborn, constantly clashing with and yelling at Zidane and the various members of Tantalus. Garnet is uncertain and out of her element, particularly when she must learn how to fit in with the more common aspects of society. As well as the dialogue itself, the character models themselves are all incredibly emotive. Perhaps the easiest character to make an example of in this case is once again Adalbert Steiner. He shakes his fists when he's irritated. This happens a lot. He leaps up and down indignantly when he's angry. This happens a lot. He holds up his sword in satisfaction when he delivers the killing blow on the final monster in every random battle. This happens a lot too. He's very strong. Speaking of the battles, I'll talk about them quite a bit more in Disc 4, but I'll just say for now that certain encounters, particularly boss battles, are often used to tell the story to great effect. Any Final Fantasy IX veteran will be able to recount quite easily their experiences, with perhaps a twinkle in their eye of getting beaten up by General Beatrix again and again and again. Getting your butt kicked in-engine by an enemy you can't defeat is a fantastic example of showing the player the difference in power levels, as opposed to just hand-waving it away in a cutscene. There are a few different battles like this, using various little narrative devices and sleight of hands to keep the story moving forwards. Regardless, one more thing I want to talk about in terms of storytelling is a neat little feature that for some reason is only present in Final Fantasy IX, that being the active time event. Final Fantasy IX confidently and with authority pushes an ensemble cast. Of course, this is a usual feature of the typical Japanese role-playing game, but with the ATE system, Final Fantasy IX takes it one step further. Upon entering a new location, usually some kind of village, town or city with current narrative significance, your party will split up, the player retaining control of just one character. Now, you could just mosey around town at your own leisure, taking in the sights for yourself and taking your mandatory trips to the shops, or you could make use of this revolutionary one-time only ATE system to experience this brave new world through the eyes of your various party members. The ATE system basically shows you what your comrades get up to when they're about town. I think this is a marvellous system and I have no idea why it was never brought back. Because of the ATE system, I can tell you that after a bad first impression, Steiner loves pickles from Lindblom. This becomes somewhat relevant to the story a little later. Thanks to the ATE system, I know that Amarant has a history in Treno with certain individuals, fleshing out a character that perhaps doesn't receive as much time and attention as others within the main story. Due to the ATE system, I got to experience Vivi's first encounter with his own mortality, standing shoulder to shoulder with his fellow Black Mages. I think there is somewhat of a tendency in a lot of party-based role-playing games to take the individual focus away from each character once their initial arc has been completed and they've been assimilated into the group. Final Fantasy IX's ATE system ensures that each party member remains relevant throughout the entire game. And it's not just for party members either. The ATE system allows you to witness things that are happening miles away from the perspective of some of Final Fantasy IX's strong supporting lineup. Of note are Zidane's comrades, the Tantalus Troop. They go on a journey of their own, effectively right the way through the game, and we get to experience it primarily through these cutaway sequences. Of course, you could argue that the story itself would ring somewhat hollow if it was not backed up by some solid world building, and thankfully, Final Fantasy IX has that in spades too. You'll be spending the bulk of the game simply wandering around the first landmass, being introduced to the four major powers. These are Alexandria, Lindblom, Burmecia and Clara. Alexandria is perhaps your most traditional fantasy medieval setting, a glimmering city with a monarchy, knights, cobblestone streets, nobles and peasants. The city of Treno is also a part of Alexandria and particularly highlights that discrepancy between the classes, rich and poor. Burmecia and Clara are counted as two nations but are located closely together, share the same peoples and ultimately originate as a result of a civil war. Burmecia is unfortunately only encountered once things have gone sideways, but boasts fascinating architecture from a proud, formerly warlike society. Clara is Burmecia's offshoot, citizens who didn't like aggression, instead choosing to found their own city atop a gigantic tree betwixt the howling winds of an undying sandstorm. You know, as you do. I saved Lindblom for last, simply because it's the best. The game knows this too. Upon initially booting up Final Fantasy IX and being presented with the old school Squaresoft logo, it fades away to immediately reveal the grand castle of Lindblom. Lindblom is, I feel, not just the greatest city in Final Fantasy IX, but perhaps the greatest location in any Final Fantasy. Of course, it is somewhat limited by the technology of the PlayStation 1, but just the very concept of Lindblum blows me away. It's a gigantic steampunk city, all encased in its enormous castle which dominates the landscape. It's divided into several different districts, those being business, theatre, and industrial, accessible only through its incredibly modern air cab system. Lindblum is also one of the best examples of Final Fantasy IX's world building because of the section of the game in which you participate in its Festival of the Hunt. Lindblum was formerly a small hunting community in the middle of a forest before industrializing and ballooning into the steampunk behemoth that it is today. The Festival of the Hunt is a way for them to memorialize their old ways and is an activity steeped in tradition. The tradition itself? Setting a bunch of hostile wild animals loose in a metropolitan location and having the locals compete to hunt them down. Take note, folks, just because something is old doesn't mean that it's good. The point is, Gaia is a world of traditions and literature, communities and conflict, being and belonging. It's not just a world that exists for the sake of the game and story, it's a world that's lived in. I've only spoken about the first continent here, the Mist Continent, because I'm trying to keep spoilers on the lighter side in this section, but needless to say, there are several more towns and locations overseas for players to uncover and experience, some with even more narrative and storytelling significance as the ones that I've mentioned here. Quick aside on the continents here, actually, since I've just brought them up, what is it with popular culture and not naming their continents and worlds properly? Final Fantasy IX is no exception here, featuring the Mist Continent, the Lost Continent, Forgotten Continent, and Outer Continent. These people have lived here for thousands of years and they couldn't come up with anything better. I get that Gaia is clearly very Mist Continent centric, as that's where all the major powers are, but even they couldn't come up with anything better than ours is a bit foggy. Anyway, so concludes my general overview of Final Fantasy IX's storytelling and world building, putting us at approximately halfway, though not really, through this bumper edition of Having a Mosey. Feel free to go and grab a cup of coffee, or tea, or milk, or something. I don't know what you drink, honestly, I'm not your dad. Anyway, once you've done that, then please enter Disc 3. As I've already stated in the previous segment, Final Fantasy IX is an ensemble drama. As it is so driven by its characters, they will be the vehicle that I'll use to talk about the major events of Final Fantasy IX, as well as how it affects them, and potentially even you, the player. In order to provide some context with which to talk about the events which shape and unite our ensemble, we'll kick things off with Queen Brane. She plays the quintessential evil stepmother role very well. The first act of the game is dominated by her shenanigans, as she demolishes the various other factions of the Mist Continent one by one. You can tell from the introductory chapters that something is amiss here by Garnet's unhappiness and desire to escape, as well as how Brane tries to retrieve her through various nefarious means. But I don't think it's until the party reaches Bermesia that the true scope of her horrifying greed, ambition and lust for power is laid bare. Acting as a weapon supplier, Kuja has provided Brane with an army of black mages, which are magical soldiers, supposedly soulless golems, to do her dirty work. You first uncover the initial traces of this plot very early into the game at the otherwise idyllic village of Dali, which houses a secret production facility underground. Using these black mages, Brane effectively annihilates Bermesia, sparing no one. A handful of the lucky inhabitants escape to Lindblum or Clara, but for the most part they've been utterly wiped off the map. It only gets worse from there. Upon reaching Clara shortly after escaping Bermesia, the party once again finds themselves at odds with Queen Brane's war machine. A small Alexandrian force disables the gigantic sandstorm which has always functioned as Clara's shield, and the giant tree is invaded by a combined army of black mages and Alexandrian troops. The party saves as many lives as they can, but ultimately have to retreat, completely outmanned and outgunned. It is at this point in the story that Eidolons come into play, and the true extent of Brane's power and barbarism is revealed. An Eidolon is an incredibly powerful being which can be summoned at the bidding of the person who possesses their stone, for either heroic or villainous means. In terms of how devastating they can be, they're effectively weapons of mass destruction. Princess Garnet is a summoner, and in possession of these stones, which Brane forcibly extracts from her shortly before her invasion of Clara begins. She summons Odin, and Clara, and anyone left on the tree, is completely and utterly obliterated in his wake. Upon returning to the area from the world map later, all you'll see is a gigantic crater in the earth. Of course, she doesn't stop there. Shortly after this, she attacks Lindblom with another eidolon. The regent rather sensibly surrenders and the city is annexed into her new empire. Fast forwarding now a little, her insatiable greed winds up being her downfall. After consolidating her power over the Mist Continent, she realises that the only real threat to her now comes from Kuja, the man who'd been supplying her with the means to maintain her reign of terror. The party gets front row seats to watch them duke it out. Despite summoning the Dragon King Eidolon Bahamut, she's still no match for Kuja, who snatches the summon from her and destroys Brane and her entire fleet. In these closing moments of Disc 2, the mists seem to clear from Brane's mind. There's a very strong implication here that she used to be a benevolent queen, taken advantage of and corrupted by Kuja for his own evil means. In this sense, she is presented as somewhat of a tragic character, though of course it is a popular staple of storytelling from Shakespearean tragedies to anime and other video games to allow death to practically absolve someone of all but the most heinous crimes. As for Kuja himself, his story is significantly more complicated than a simple lust for power, and I'll be touching upon that in a little while. In the meantime though, let's talk about the main party. Marketed as the true main protagonist of this game, Zidane would be the obvious place to start, but I'm going to leave him until last, for reasons that should hopefully become clear in time. Instead, I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball and start by talking about his opposite, the flaming Amarant. Amarant is a jerk. They really ain't getting around that, but as a character, he gets a bad rap. Amarant is the last person to properly integrate into the party, first introduced in an adversarial manner as one of the two bounty hunters hired by Queen Brane to assassinate Vivi and retrieve Garnet's pendant. Amarant's whole thing is that he acts alone. He plays the sullen, mopey edgelord perhaps a bit too well, seeing as he appears to be a distinctly unpopular character amongst the fanbase, but I do think that his presence has a solid purpose, especially if you read between the lines a little. The whole reason Amarant joins the party is because he can't get a read on Zidane. Zidane is Amarant's foil. Amarant has always gotten by acting alone, yet here is this happy-go-lucky character who, between the Tantalus troop and his current circle of friends, has nearly always relied on the help of others. Somehow, despite this, Zidane still beats Amarant when challenged to a duel, and this truly messes him up. Now, you may be aware of a particular trope when it comes to Japanese role-playing games. It's usually a somewhat cynical criticism levelled at the genre, in which ultimately every, or almost every, JRPG can be summed up as using the power of friendship to defeat God. And I will give you, it is a very common narrative direction taken by Japanese game developers or mangakas. This idea that with teamwork, relying on others, boosting each other's strengths, even gods can be brought to their knees. Point is, nothing is impossible when approached as a team. This is Zidane's philosophy, and it is right there in his character splash screen. You don't need a reason to help people. Zidane by nature is selfless, surrounding himself by like-minded people, aiding them during some of their most difficult hours, aided by them during some of his. Amarant as a character exists to challenge this idea. In Ibsen's Castle, he confronts Zidane on this directly, asserting that he'll be able to accomplish their goals in the dungeon by working alone, faster than Zidane and his team can by working together. Of course, it goes horribly wrong for him, and Zidane must come to his rescue after he takes a bit of a pratfall through a trapdoor. After this, Amarant is somewhat humbled, but not outwardly that much of a changed man. At least, not through what he says, anyway. However, actions speak louder than words with someone as understated as Amarant, and you can totally see him there in the crowd at the end of the game, clapping away as the happy ending unfurls in front of him, the big old softy. Next up, I'm going to talk about Freya. Freya herself is a badass, and honestly that appears to be the consensus. The Dragoon Knight class has always been one of the cooler roles in the Final Fantasy series. Fearsome lance-wielding warriors who can leap great distances and cast powerful support spells. This aspect of her is never really in question, but instead her relevance as a character over the rest of the story. On the surface, Freya's arc is effectively played out by the early hours of Disc 2. As a Burmesian, Freya is forced to witness the destruction of her homeland, suffer the tragedy of being unable to save Clara, as well as cope with the effective loss of her lover, Sir Fratley. Fratley isn't dead, but suffers from amnesia with no recollection as to who she is. As I said, this all happens within the first third of the game, give or take, so there's been a certain amount of criticism levelled at her arc, which supposedly ends too early. However, I have something of a rebuttal. Freya's story is summarised rather fittingly and concisely by the game as despair. This is entirely appropriate. Over the course of an incredibly short space of time, Freya loses almost everything. Her family, her friends, her homeland, her lover, her purpose. This would quite understandably destroy most people. How are you supposed to come back from something like that? Going forwards, Freya's arc is more passive, but it's certainly there. Freya makes a choice not to get weighed down by her past, instead signing herself up for Zidane's cause and fighting for a better future. Just her presence at all throughout the rest of the game, in my opinion, is a testament to the strength of her willpower and character. By relying on Zidane and the rest of the party, she's once again able to find a purpose and carry on, eventually even managing to rekindle her romance with Sir Fratley as they set out to rebuild Burmecia. To lighten things up a little, I'm going to talk about Quina. I love Quina. Quina is based. Quina's whole shtick is that they're hungry. Ravenously so. So ravenously hungry that they'll eat almost anything, especially frogs. They're also your blue mage, so perhaps one of your most flexible and powerful characters. They learn all of their abilities from eating different enemies in battle. As you can imagine, Quina is a somewhat chaotic addition to the party. They're entirely possible to skip in Disc 1, though I wouldn't advise that, and come and go fairly frequently until they finally join you as a permanent party member in Disc 3. Despite coming and going and exerting such gluttonous energy, Quina is still a valuable member of the team, having multiple moments in which they bond with the rest of the party. They assist Vivi in his identity crisis. They help Aiko when she's trying to cook a meal to impress Zidane, and when the party has to all pair off to fight 4 different bosses at once, Quina is proud to be the last picked because, and I quote, "leftovers good." Again, based. I think the chief lesson to be learned from Quina is simply to get out there and explore the world for new experiences. They seem relatively content to just stay in the swamp catching frogs until they're given the boot by Master Quail, spurred on to join the party and try out all new types of food. Perhaps the real treasure was the food we ate along the way. Moving on to Aiko, we simultaneously come upon the theme of loneliness. Aiko is a summoner, the last of her kind, or so she thinks, from the ancient village of Madain Sari. Madain Sari was initially a thriving land, populated by a whole community of capable summoners, yet was wiped out by Garland, who considered them a threat to his ultimate goals. He'll become important later. When the party first encounters Aiko, she's in a bit of a bind, and she's had to get by via stealing food and supplies from the nearby town of Conde Petit. In the aftermath of the destruction of Madain Sari, it had just been her and her grandfather. At some point before the events of the game, he passed away, but not before making Aiko promise that she wouldn't leave Madain Sari until she was 16 years old. She is only 6 when the party encounters her. Zidane helps her realise that she'll be far better off finally leaving Madain Sari and joining them, despite what she promised her grandfather, because she needs to be true to herself. Whilst her grandfather would have simply acted out of a concern for her safety, it has left her lonely and miserable. Once again, on her splash screen, her plight is summarised succinctly as, "I don't want to be alone anymore." Due to her naivety and inexperience with others, she initially gains a crush on Zidane, whilst becoming fiercely jealous of Dagger in the process. Fortunately, as the story continues, and it becomes clear to her that it could never happen between her and Zidane, she grows closer to Dagger instead, being there for her in some of the princess's most challenging moments, becoming a vital part of reconnecting Garnet to her roots. She's also instrumental in dispelling the lock on the Aoife tree, which turns out to be a vital piece of the world's puzzle. Encountering the party allows Aiko to open up to others and rejoin the world at large. By the end of the game, she becomes the foster child of the Lord Regent of Lindblom and his wife, gaining a family, though it's not entirely clear as to who adopts who. Speaking of the summoners of Madain Sari, this brings us rather neatly to Princess Garnet, or Dagger, for reasons that will become clear rather shortly. Amongst other things, Dagger represents one half of the love story Final Fantasy IX tells, with the other half of course being Zidane. Some aspects of their chemistry have aged well, others less so, but overall, playing it through again, their blooming romance does feel natural and organic for the most part. As I said earlier, Garnet is notable for being the princess that actually wants to be kidnapped, which is a neat twist on the formula and dominates the early narrative of the game. Initially, she basically wants to run away from home. Understandably so, I might add, seeing as her mother, Queen Brane, has been acting significantly stranger of late, showing signs of imperialist ambitions. Her plan is aided timely by the arrival of Tantalus, already sent to kidnap her by the regent of Lindblum, Cid, who, coincidentally, was exactly the person to whom she wanted to talk to. In the early hours of the game, Dagger's biggest struggle is learning how to fit in with regular people. Having been sheltered in the castle for as long as she could remember, Zidane takes her under his wing, teaching her how to be more casual around others. However, upon reaching Lindblum and meeting the regent, she tries to take matters into her own hands, sneaking off with Steiner in an attempt to talk to her mother directly and put a stop to her evil plans. Unfortunately, this goes about as well as you can imagine, and she has to be rescued by the party as well as General Beatrix. Upon encountering Madain Sari, Dagger remembers who she is, that is to say, Sarah, a fellow survivor of the village of the Summoners. Despite this, she still ascends to the throne following the death of her mother and makes a valiant last stand with Aiko's help when Alexandria is attacked shortly thereafter. Dagger's conviction is described as devotion in the rotating splash screens, and it's very easy to see why. Throughout the game, she attempts to shoulder the weight of the world by herself, first by attempting to confront Brane on her own, but then by taking full responsibility for the fate of Alexandria, literally losing her voice for quite some time in the sheer despair of being unable to defend it from Garland. Fortunately, with the help of Zidane and her friends, she's able to rally herself, fighting alongside them to defeat Garland, Kuja, and ultimately save Gaia. Of course, where would a princess be without her knight in shining armour? Unfortunately, in Garnet's case, this is, Steiner. Captain Adelbert Steiner of the Bumbling Knights of Pluto. I love Steiner. He may honestly be my favourite character. He certainly has one of the most clearly defined arcs in the whole game. When we meet Steiner, he has a very clear worldview. Everything exists in neat little boxes for him. The Queen is wonderful and benevolent. She'd never do anything wrong. The princess is safest in the castle. She must be returned at all costs. The Tantalus troop are nothing but thieves and criminals, villains even. However, despite acting as a very clear foil to Zidane early on, he still shows respect and kindness to Vivi, which is a nice way of demonstrating early into the game that there's more to Steiner than meets the eye. As the story progresses, Steiner is forced to confront his preconceptions about, well, almost everything really. Realising that Queen Brane is truly a tyrant, he immediately realises the error of his ways and thinking, and stands with the party, helping Zidane and Dagger escape Alexandria Castle and Brane's evil clutches. Ultimately, from day one, Steiner is a man of conviction and principle, a man who just wants to do the right thing. Of course, it's a testament to his character that he's able to look at the world and adjust how he acts and behaves accordingly, not becoming blinded to the notion of his long-held beliefs, his preconceptions or prejudices, or his sense of duty to the Queen. By the end of the game, he even shows great respect for Zidane, allowing him time alone with the princess and showing that they have his blessing to be together. And now we come to Vivi, and perhaps the moment that quite a lot of you have been waiting for. I certainly have. Boyish in appearance, he is earnest, loyal, and childlike. He's also very clumsy. Vivi's story is beautiful, thought-provoking, and frankly rather moving. Vivi is a character that, despite having a face which consists only of two glowing yellow voids, illustrates perhaps the most emotion and expression of anyone in the main cast. Vivi's tale is a story of identity, of the value of life, and the inevitability of death. Initially behaving as the supposed soulless golems in their first encounters, Vivi and the party eventually stumble upon the village of the Black Mages, a small community of Black Mages like Vivi who were constructed initially as mindless weapons of war, but gained sentience and ran away. Very quickly, Vivi uncovers what appears to be a graveyard, where he discovers, much to his horror, that Black Mages generally only live for a year or so, until they, in their words, stop. As a prototype, Vivi supposedly has a slightly longer lifespan, but still far less than the average human. What follows for Vivi is a deep existential crisis. He laments how much time he has left, what the point of life even is, and where he'll end up too once he stops. There's a certain phrase that comes to mind when I think of Vivi. It's a Japanese idiom, and it is simply mono no aware. Translated literally, it means the empathy of things, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Mono no aware is the wistful appreciation of the beauty of the moment, to know that this too shall pass and that this fleeting happiness will one day only exist in memory. It is this message that Zidane conveys to Vivi to help him when he's down, that life is precisely valuable because it's finite, not despite it. All we can truly do is appreciate the things that we have right now, the people, the things, and the moments of joy and satisfaction, because the future is always going to be uncertain. After all, perhaps one of the greatest tragedies that we can inflict upon ourselves is to become so consumed by death or what happens to us in the next life that we forget to live in this one. Besides the help from Zidane, Vivi also finds comfort from his fellow black mages. Despite having even shorter lifespans than him, they're still able to go about their lives and even find those moments of joy. Look no further than the birth of Bobby Corwin, an adorable little chocobo baby rescued and raised by some of the black mages of the village. These are the kinds of moments that make life worth living for Vivi, and he's able to step back from the abyss of existential despair, aided by his friends, and help them complete their quest. Unfortunately, the implication heavily is that Vivi has passed on by the time the credits roll, though he still gets the last word in the form of a powerful monologue at the end of the game, which reads, "I always talked about you, Zidane, how you were a very special person to us, because you taught us all how important life is. You taught me that life doesn't last forever. That's why we have to help each other and live life to the fullest. Even if you say goodbye, you'll always be in our hearts. So I know we're not alone anymore. Why I was born, how I wanted to live. Thank you for giving me time to think, to keep doing what you set your heart on. It's a very hard thing to do. We were all so courageous. What to do when I felt lonely. That was the only thing you couldn't teach me. But we need to figure out the answer for ourselves. I'm so happy I met everyone. I wish we could have gone on more adventures, but I guess we all have to say goodbye someday. Everyone, thank you. Farewell. My memories will be part of the sky." Okay, I think it's finally time to talk about Zidane. You may have noticed an undercurrent surging through everyone's story with varying degrees in intensity over the last 7 character studies. I'm of course talking about Zidane's impact on each and every character. He helps them all in one way or another. He demonstrates to Amaranth the benefits of working together, or, the power of friendship. He's there for Freya in her darkest hours. He helps Quina get out there and see the world and eat more food. He frees Aiko from a life of solitude. He supports Dagger unconditionally when she goes through hell and back, quite literally for Queen and country. He becomes the man Steiner trusts implicitly to look after the princess, and he helps Vivi to see the value of life itself. He's a man who wears his heart on his sleeve and has full confidence and faith in his friends. You'd be forgiven for thinking that he's just some happy-go-lucky guy with barely an arc of his own, simply there to drive the story along and act as a vehicle to explore the stories of the other characters. Of course, this is incorrect. Zidane faces his own arc, his true test of character, but at a considerably later point in the game to everyone else. I mentioned earlier that we were going to talk about Kuja eventually, as well as Garland, and now is as good a time as any to bring them back up. For you see, Garland, Kuja, and Zidane are not of this world. To keep a long and rather complicated story short, Garland hails from the planet Terra, an ancient civilization that fell into decline and all but extinction. To keep the planet going and to sustain the life that it has, Terra has to keep assimilating new planets, stealing the souls of its inhabitants and using it to fuel the life force of Terra and the Terrans themselves. Over the course of Final Fantasy IX, it becomes clear that Gaia is Terra's latest target. In order to house the souls of Terrans being revived, Garland creates a race he calls the Genomes. They are a race of people with medium-length blonde hair, human characteristics, and a monkey's tail. Seem familiar? Indeed. Perhaps one of the biggest revelations of the late game was that Zidane was originally created by Garland in order to infiltrate Gaia and eventually aid in its destruction and assimilation into Terra. In the form of a cracking 1-2 punch, it's also revealed that Kuja is also a genome. Kuja had been behind kickstarting the Alexandrian War to accelerate the destruction of Gaia and expedite the souls to Terra, but went rogue due to his own unfettered greed and ambition. Besides Kuja, Zidane, and one other genome, they all appear to be and behave as empty, soulless golems. You may notice a teeny tiny little bit of a parallel with Vivi's dilemma here. Learning the truth of his origins plunges Zidane into despair, anguish, and hopelessness. After spending his entire life as someone who exists to help others, here he discovers that his original purpose was simply to destroy. However, what goes around comes around, and it is at this moment, this shining moment, at Zidane's lowest point, that Final Fantasy IX all comes together with the culmination of Zidane's own journey and realization. Eloquently accompanied by one of the best musical numbers in the game, Final Fantasy IX tells Zidane and you that no matter how great the obstacle, how desperate the circumstances, or how hard the fight is, that there are always people there for you. You are not alone. This is perhaps my favourite sequence in all of gaming. Initially so depressed that he's literally struggling to walk, Zidane drags himself down a long corridor, getting into fight after fight. As he does, friend after friend appears. Zidane is the man whose motto is, "You don't need a reason to help people," who'll always be there for others unflinchingly, now being assisted by his friends, returning the favour, and rescuing him from his current frame of mind. After this incredible chain of events, Garland reveals to Kuja that he too is mortal and doesn't have that much time left for that matter. Unlike Vivi, who's learned to take that in his stride, Kuja goes ballistic, killing Garland and destroying Terra. Fortunately, the party are able to flee on Kuja's airship, the Invincible, back to Gaia. This, at last, brings us to the closing act of Final Fantasy IX. The genomes are rescued and adopted by the Black Mages, a wonderful pairing, and with a little help from some friends, the party chases Kuja through the portal in an epic sequence into the realm of Memoria, the final dungeon of Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX places great importance on memories, arguing that they are a vital building block in the soul of a person, if not their soul itself. Memories are eternal. Memories are tangible. It is the combined memory of every soul which has lived upon Gaia which has formed this curious realm, built around the ultimate representation of life within Final Fantasy, the Crystal. It is where Kuja has chosen to make his last stand, as he desperately tries to end the world by destroying the crystal, rather than see it go on without him. The party defeats Kuja, and he disappears, though not before launching a devastating attack, Ultima, which knocks them all down. You know how I said that there were basically two major antagonists in Final Fantasy IX, Kuja and Brane? I lied. Turns out, there's actually a third in the form of a surprise final boss battle, Necron. Now, I've seen quite a bit of controversy surrounding the existence of Necron, and I'd just like to say a few words in their defense. Remember how I said at the beginning of Disc 2 of this review that within Final Fantasy IX's narrative there was a core, an answer to life, the universe, and everything? That's what I think this last fight against Necron represents. Upon your first encounter with Necron, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they've just been shoehorned in out of nowhere, simply to bloat out the final section of the game and arbitrarily increase the difficulty, but I would argue that the presence of Necron actually makes perfect sense. You see, Necron is not just some stand-in for death, or some random all-powerful being or deity. Necron is the physical representation, the anthropomorphic personification, if you will, of nihilism. Necron is the embodiment of the idea that life is meaningless, with Kuja's selfish actions as the supposed proof that it simply isn't worth living. Final Fantasy IX is about the melodies of life. It's the main musical theme of the game, the song that Garnet was taught as a little girl, and the tune itself is used to provide the backbone of many different tracks in the game's soundtrack. Much like a melody, life has its ups and downs, its verses and choruses, its changes of tempo and mood. Over the course of the game, each character in the party had their own melody, with challenges both big and small. What has subsequently followed has been them learning to take these difficulties in their strides and overcome them. Zidane and Vivi, and maybe even Freya, are particularly useful examples here, but everyone has had their own difficulties to work through. By placing Necron right at the end of the game and making the fight so, almost annoyingly, difficult, Final Fantasy IX tells us that perhaps the hardest battles that we must face are our own demons, our own sense of despair. Only once the cast of Final Fantasy IX has confronted and bested hopelessness with a fierce desire to live no matter what, can they truly win the war. And make no mistake, you, your life and your future are always worth fighting for. In this sense, Necron lurks just off screen for most of the game, before the curtain rises and the gloves finally come off. To round things out, we're going to come full circle as we look once more at Lord Avon's I Want to Be Your Canary. In the very early hours of the game, the piece is effectively allowed to play out as intended. I Want to Be Your Canary is a tragedy, a tale of two doomed lovers, Cornelia and Marcus, fated not to be. In the original performance, a Cornelia played by Dagger dies, accidentally stabbed by Marcus as he attempts to run her father through. At the end of the game, a year has passed since the events of Memoria. Zidane has gone missing, and Princess Garnet now rules over Alexandria as queen. Another performance of I Want to Be Your Canary by the theatre troupe Tantalus is about to begin. This time around, the play seems to progress as normal, though rather curiously, Marcus has been recast. In a stunning twist, this masked performer tears off his robe to reveal Zidane, alive and well, calling out to Garnet directly. Dagger rushes down to the stage and embraces Zidane. The characters of Cornelia and Marcus were a metaphor, you see. In the words of the bard, the play's the thing. In standing up to Brana, Garland, Kuja, and Necron, in rewriting fate itself and resurrecting the crystal of life, I Want to Be Your Canary also gets a rewrite, as Marcus and Cornelia, so to speak, finally get their happy ending. So ends Final Fantasy IX on a beautifully bittersweet note, as life and love wins the day. If you've watched everything up to this point so far, thank you so much. Please feel free to go and refill your coffee, your tea, your milk. I don't know what you drink, honestly. I'm not your mum. And once you've done that, please enter Disc 4. Did you know that Final Fantasy IX is a video game? I'll be honest, I'd begun to forget that. Much like its various themes and characters make up a succulent cocktail of delicious and delectable ingredients, the contributing aspects of Final Fantasy IX's gameplay also form up to make a solid, reliable, classic JRPG. I'll start by talking about basic navigation. Final Fantasy IX is a child of the PlayStation 1, almost aggressively, unashamedly so. The most immediate, obvious example of this right away is its use of pre-rendered backgrounds. Already found to be a visual success in Dino Crisis, Resident Evil, and Final Fantasy VII and VIII, Final Fantasy IX also made use of these visual aids to tremendous effect. Using artwork instead of actual assets allowed games of this generation to really go all out with their vision and sense of scale. Whilst the city of Alexandria is only really a handful of screens and a select few interior spaces, it truly feels like an epic, grand, and lived-in fairy tale city. In 2000, perhaps the only possible way to do the gigantic steampunk city of Lindblom justice was to have it appear as beautifully crafted pages in a child's picture book. That is Final Fantasy IX's aesthetic, and the one thing that would absolutely need to be preserved in any rumoured hypothetical remake. Regardless, this is how the characters and you, the player, see the world at large. Every single location of interest is explored through a series of interconnecting screens, containing a distinct variety of different locales. Some of these locations are begging to be explored and taken in thoroughly, to the point where I think it is particularly fitting that the default movement speed in Final Fantasy IX is set to walk. Is there any more effective coating of full immersion than there is to simply slowly walk through the world that has been crafted for you? To stay a while and smell the flowers? You're also properly incentivized to explore every nook and cranny of Final Fantasy IX's pre-rendered world, as almost every screen is fit to bursting with various secrets and items. Of course, being the old school JRPG that it is, time spent between the various towns, dungeons and places of interest is time spent navigating a proper classic overworld. Final Fantasy IX initially presents this overworld very early into the experience, but it is still a while before it can be explored freely. Final Fantasy IX, for the bulk of its experience, is a very linear game, but finely crafted in such a manner whereby it never feels constricting. When at a location, they'll almost exclusively be experienced on foot, yet when navigating the world at large, Final Fantasy IX presents you with a number of different options to get around. Initially, as you can probably imagine, you'll be roughhousing it on foot. This directly limits where you can go to your immediate surroundings, and leaves you at the mercy of the various creatures and monsters which stalk the lands. However, a few hours in, you'll unlock access to that classic Final Fantasy series staple, the Chocobo. This is your first vehicle of sorts, and is heavily upgradable as a part of the game mechanic that I'll go into a bit later. Once you reach the approximate halfway point of the game, early into the third disc, you unlock your first ship, at which point the world truly starts to open up. This first ship is limited only to the seas and oceans of Gaia, but eventually you unlock the airship, at which point the sky is literally the limit. These later vehicles are actually explorable too, allowing you to chill with your friends and crew, as well as switch out party members and equipment. Of course, it wouldn't be a role-playing game without combat, and over the duration of Final Fantasy IX, you'll find yourself getting into many scraps. I consider Final Fantasy IX to have knocked every other aspect of its story and gameplay out of the park thus far, so how do I feel about the battle system? I hate it! Okay, that's an exaggeration, that's a joke. I'm exaggerating for comic effect. Only slightly though. You see, Final Fantasy IX is not turn-based, neither is it a real-time action-based system. Instead, it features something called the active time battle system. This was initially debuted all the way back in Final Fantasy IV and was eventually retired after Final Fantasy IX. So here's the thing, I see what they were going for here. Practically from its inception, Final Fantasy has sought to reinvent the wheel, to experiment within the genre and mix things up. The active time battle is clearly an evolution of sorts on the turn-based battle system of something like Dragon Quest, but in this game in particular, still plays out far too slowly to be considered active or even that engaging. Instead of being able to actually press buttons to engage the enemy directly, or input your orders in advance before watching them play out, you instead simply have to wait and watch helplessly for your character's turn gauge to fill up before you can do anything with them. This is particularly frustrating when you're in battle with a tough enemy and you're just kinda stuck there, waiting for what are essentially character initiative loading times. Don't get me wrong, there are some tactical benefits. Once a character's gauge is filled up, they can act at any time. You aren't forced to use them then and there. As such, you can hold off on using a certain character and/or ability until the situation actually warrants it. I found myself doing this quite a lot with Garnet and Aiko's healing abilities, which was certainly rather helpful. However, to me, the active time battle system simply feels like a relic of a different era, a product of trying to do something different without fully committing either way, casual non-conformity. Final Fantasy X returned to the turn-based model to great effect, and Final Fantasy XII had the incredibly innovative Gambit system, whilst Final Fantasy IX was unfortunately consigned to sit on the fence with its not quite turn-based, not quite action-based system. Thankfully, the systems and mechanics around and adjacent to the combat system are genuinely excellent, and perhaps one of the best implementations of leveling up in the whole series. You see, characters in Final Fantasy IX don't simply gain new abilities by leveling up, instead earning a simple base increase in their various stats, health, strength, mana points, and so on. Instead, upon completing a battle in Final Fantasy IX, you earn two different types of experience. XP is as you'd expect, and contributes towards gaining those levels and increasing those stats that I just talked about. However, you'll also gain several points of something called AP, or ability points. Helpfully, ability points do exactly as they say on the tin, enabling your characters to learn new actions and spells. However, there's a bit more to it than that. When it comes to unlocking new abilities to research in Final Fantasy IX, we come to the armor and weapon system. You see, abilities aren't just sat, chilling in your character's DNA, waiting to be unlocked at an arbitrary level, but are instead uncovered by equipping different armaments. As soon as you equip something, you're able to use those abilities right away, but on the other side of the coin, you'll lose the chance to use them if you unequip them before you've acquired the necessary AP to learn them. Steiner's first sword, for example, the broadsword, teaches him a move called Beast Killer, allowing him to fight beast-type monsters with greater effect. However, his next sword up, the Iron Sword, teaches him something different entirely, the Minus Strike. Odds are, you'll have already received the Iron Sword before you finish training Steiner up to master Beast Killer, and as such, a choice needs to be made. Do you hold on to your current, weaker sword until he's learned Beast Killer permanently, or move straight on to the stronger weapon, for the flat stat upgrade, losing your ability to learn Beast Killer at that moment? If you're a bit of an obsessive ability hoarder like me, you'll know your own truth here, but there really isn't a correct answer per se, as certain abilities are in no way as useful as others. Some can even be learned from multiple different pieces of equipment over the course of the game. As such, Final Fantasy IX places the onus on the player to weigh up the choices themselves, deciding between the short-term benefit of using the stronger sword versus the long-term gain of unlocking each and every ability. It's a brilliant system, and I love it. I love it so much that it effectively carries the rather dull combat, in my opinion. Of course, besides exploring this brave new world and getting into fights with the people in it, Final Fantasy IX offers a number of interesting side activities to distract from or perhaps even enhance the main storyline. The first one I'm going to talk about now is Chocobo Hot and Cold. This game rules and would make a killing as a mobile app or something, rather cleverly. Just before leaving Lindblum for the first time, Final Fantasy IX makes you stare through a telescope and examine just what's coming next, optional or otherwise, in your quest. One of these locations is the Chocobo Forest, one of the 3 hubs for the minigame Chocobo Hot and Cold. Named after the notion of getting warmer once you're getting closer to finding something, and colder when you're led astray, Chocobo Hot and Cold is all about using your Chocobo buddy Choco to find treasures buried within the Chocobo Forest. You'll know you're getting closer to finding something because Choco will begin to squawk louder and louder. Typically you'll find quite a lot of chod, i.e. standard potions and antidotes and the like, but occasionally you'll stumble upon something called a chocograph. This is particularly exciting as these are essentially maps for the overworld at large and point you in the direction of where the true treasures can be found. These treasures range from useful items in bulk to new upgrades for Choco, such as the ability to traverse the mountains, the oceans and the skies, but eventually even powerful endgame equipment. All of this is framed in its own narrative side campaign, in which Choco discovers his roots and eventually finds his way home to Chocobo Paradise. Next up, we have Mognet. Mognet is adorable and I love it. The Moogles are at their cutest in Final Fantasy IX, appearing regularly and primarily functioning as your save and rest points over the course of the game, because hovering question marks and sparkly spots are boring. However, you'll also note that there's an option to select something called Mognet. Mognet is the Moogles' mail service. It's basically how they communicate over long distances. At the beginning of the game, it's established that their regular Mognet machine is broken down, so now it falls to you to ensure that every letter ends up in the hands of their intended recipient. Thus begins the tale of Postman Zidane and his black and white mages, delivering the mail all over Gaia and beyond. You'll eventually receive a powerful item from Mognet Central for completing this quest, but I honestly find undertaking Mognet to be its own reward, as it's fascinating to see what the Moogles are all saying between themselves, responding and reacting to the various happenings in the world around you. As a quick aside, you'll also note the reoccurrence of the Moogle Stiltskin, a traveller exploring Gaia who needs your help and funding to continue his journey. The whole thing is cute AF, and I'm here for it. Additionally, there are a number of other little mini-games with various benefits, such as catching frogs with Quina, the infamous skipping rope minigame, as well as the fantastic one-time only sword fighting sequence between Zidane and Blanc in the opening performance of I Want to Be Your Canary. However, there's one other minigame, an activity that I'd be remiss in glossing over completely because it's perhaps the most controversial part of the whole game. Oh yeah, I'm talking about Tetramaster. Now here's the thing. I don't have a whole lot to add to the whole Tetramaster debacle because after playing through and beating Final Fantasy IX on multiple different occasions over the last couple of years, I'm honestly still at a bit of a loss as to how the whole thing is even supposed to work. Triple Triad, Magic the Gathering, or Gwent, this is not, but it's fine. There absolutely seems to be a strong element of luck here, but thankfully Final Fantasy IX gives you all the cards you'll ever need just by fighting random battles or playing through and exploring the game as normal. Yes, there is a rather daft segment in the story where you must undertake 3 compulsory card battles, but in my own anecdotal experience, I've never had too much trouble getting past this segment. I'll be the first to admit, however, that once the card tournament is over, I never think about the minigame again. In the spirit of saving the best until last, I am now finally going to talk about Final Fantasy IX's music. Composed by Nobuo Uematsu, Final Fantasy IX's OST is comprised of a whopping 100 plus songs, conveying absolutely every mood, every event, and every theme that the narrative wishes to convey in that moment. Normally I've stayed away from including the actual soundtrack in my Having a Mosey series, but I simply couldn't fathom discussing this game without being able to actively show you how incredible its soundtrack truly is. So many moments within the story are framed excellently by its musical accompaniment, whether it be the aforementioned "You Are Not Alone" sequence to the sad, epic beauty of the fall of Burmecia, or the blood-pumping, badass bassline introduction to Final Fantasy IX's incredible battle music, where perhaps the visuals of Final Fantasy IX have begun to show their age. The subtle, fantastical elegance of Uematsu's compositions, his touching dedication and tribute to the melodies of life continue to withstand and even defy the tests of time. When all is said and done, and everything is put together, Final Fantasy IX is even greater than the sum of its parts. It's a video game that transcends the medium, becoming something else, perhaps a literary masterpiece, perhaps high art, or perhaps merely a fond compilation of memories, a guided tour of the melodies of life. Final Fantasy IX is an emotional roller coaster. From the beginning, the most casual of observers may dismiss the game as nothing more than light-hearted whimsy. However, over the course of its 30 to 40 hours, Final Fantasy IX asks some big questions with impossible answers, dives into the very psyche of the human condition, and deals with the topics of life, death, and nihilism head-on. Final Fantasy IX is not only a game that makes you think, but a game that makes you feel, not just in the moment, but for days, weeks, months, and perhaps even years afterwards. It's Final Fantasy's greatest hits, its home run, its victory lap. It's far and away my favourite game in the Final Fantasy series and a firm contender for my favourite video game of all time. Thank you for taking the time today to sit down with me and explore just how incredible this game truly is. Even though I do consider 9 to be the pinnacle of this amazing series, please do expect more Final Fantasy on this channel in the future, particularly Final Fantasy VI and Final Fantasy XII. With all that said, please do consider joining me next time when I'll be talking about a different game. We'll be tackling a niche PS2 classic which dares to answer that oft-posed question: what would it be like if Gran Turismo was chibi?